But let's get going with the webinar. This is what you're all here for. In case you missed it earlier, I'll be taking questions at the end. There will be about 10 minutes or so at the end for me to chat about analysis services security, or indeed anything analysis services or Power Query or Power BI related that you want to ask me about, that you think I might know about. I probably should have introduced myself earlier. I would imagine most of you have come across me somewhere. My name is Chris Webb, and I'm a UK-based consultant and trainer specializing in analysis services and Power BI and all kinds of stuff. And these are all my links, so if you want to contact me after, you've got my email address there, you've got my Twitter handle, you can see my blog and my various websites. Right, some assumptions about this webinar. I'm going to assume you know analysis services multidimensional, and I'm going to assume you know the basics of analysis services multidimensional security. I'm not going to be covering anything basic in this. Really, we're just going to be looking at some advanced topics in analysis services security. It'll be a little bit episodic. We will be skipping through from topic to topic, but hopefully there will be some interesting stuff for you. And even if you're quite advanced with analysis services, maybe there'll be one or two things that you'll be able to learn. In terms of the agenda, we will first of all talk about dimension security, but only the interesting bits. No boring stuff here, no basic stuff. Then we'll talk about testing and monitoring security using connection string properties and profiler and things like that. Then we'll talk about cell security, and again, the interesting bits, and then finish up with a chat about dynamic security. And then at the end, we will have probably about 10 minutes to answer questions and aim to finish at about 2 o'clock. So let's start talking. Dimension security. I'm going to assume you know what dimension security is. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through setting up some dimension security so that you can see how it works, and also so we can point out some of the interesting topics about dimension security that are worth mentioning. All right, I have here in Visual Studio a very simple a very simple cube. And in this cube, I have got a number of dimensions: customer, date, employee, product, and the data is based on AdventureWorks. There's just two measure groups, internet sales and sales quota, and I've got some of the dimensions added to the cube. And we've got a couple of measures: sales amount, tax amount, sales amount, quota. Nothing very, very interesting, but this is what I'm going to use to do all of my demos. Now, here is a new role. I have created the role. I have given it access to the cube. And let's say that I want to set up some dimension security. Now, what are some of the less obvious things about dimension security that we might need to talk about? The first thing to mention is that when you're setting up dimension security, the first thing you've got to do in your role is choose the dimension that you want to apply security to. And you do that in this drop-down box up here. And when you click on that drop-down box, you see a list of dimensions. Now, why do you see dimensions twice? It's important to understand the difference between the dimensions shown here and the dimensions shown here. What we've got up here are known as the database dimensions, and what we've got down here are the cube dimensions. So when you create a dimension in analysis services in Visual Studio, you're creating a database dimension. So this is the dimension that you can edit in Visual Studio that gets processed. Then you get to add that dimension to one or more cubes. And an instance of a database dimension inside a cube is a cube dimension. So what we've got up here is the customer database dimension, and here we have the customer cube dimension inside the AdventureWorks cube. Now, which one should I use for applying dimension security? Good question. In general, you should always use the database dimension. If you apply dimension security to your database dimension, then that security will be applied to every cube dimension inside your project. So if I have multiple cubes here that contain the customer dimension, if I set security up here, then that security will be applied to every single cube that contains the customer dimension. If, on the other hand, I was to apply my security here on the customer cube dimension, I'm only going to get security applied in the AdventureWorks cube. And if I go away and create another cube that contains the customer dimension, the security won't be applied there. So, first good tip, always apply security at the database dimension level. Except, well, there are two exceptions. First of all, if you want to apply security to measures, that's got to happen at the cube level, because of course the measures dimension only appears inside a cube. The second is a fairly long-running bug or problem. What I've got here is a date dimension, and it appears inside my cube twice, once as order date and once as ship date. So I'm using role-playing dimensions here. If you try and set up dimension security on a database dimension which is used as a role-playing dimension, you will find that when you connect to the cube, you get some mysterious errors if you connect through a role. That is just a limitation of dimension security. It's been like that ever since I can remember. I think it's one of those features rather than bugs that's ever going to be fixed. So in this situation, if I wanted to apply security to the date dimension, I would have to apply it on order date or ship date or both. I would not be able to apply it up here. So that's cube dimensions and database dimensions. Moving on to actually applying security. When we set up dimension security, we have two options. We can say, let's select everything and deselect the boxes, and let's deselect everything and just select what we want. So if I go back to Visual Studio here, let's imagine we're setting up dimension security on the product dimension. And let's look at product category. So I've got a whole bunch of product categories here, and I want my role to only display data for bikes. Now, looking at this user interface, you would think, well, okay, I can get bikes just by unticking all of these boxes. Or on the other hand, I can deselect everything and select bikes. And, you know, apart from this very, very small icon that's appeared here, you would think they are more or less the same thing. This is a big mistake. Actually, this and this are very different. And in fact, you can see the difference more easily if you go over to the Advanced tab. So if I was to untick components, clothing, accessories, and unknown, and we go to the Advanced tab, you can see that I've got an MDX expression in my denied member set text box. And the denied member set is effectively saying which are the members on this hierarchy that I will not have access to. On the other hand, if I deselect everything and tick bikes and go to the Advanced tab, you'll see that actually I don't have anything in the denied member set, but I have something in the allowed member set. So the allowed member set is controlling what I am allowed to see. And the difference between these two options is that in this situation where I deselect everything and ticked bikes, deselecting everything says by default you don't have access to any members on this hierarchy except the ones that I tick. So I've ticked bikes here, and I can see that I am allowed access to bikes. That means that if any new product categories come along in the future, then I'm not going to have access to them by default. If, on the other hand, I choose select all members and deselect everything here, and then go to the Advanced tab, then you can see that I have denied access to components, clothing, accessories, and the unknown member. But if a new member comes along on my product category hierarchy, then I will be able to see that, and that's potentially dangerous. So, next good tip: if you're setting up dimension security, always use the deselect all members option and tick the items that you want to see, because that's going to be the only truly safe way of making sure that people only see the members on that hierarchy that they're allowed to see. Now that we've seen these allowed sets and denied sets, it's a good idea to understand exactly how they work. So the allowed set, as we saw, is an MDX set expression that controls the members on a hierarchy that you are allowed to see. The denied set allows you to, it gives the set of members that you aren't allowed to see. And basically, when you put them all together, members of a role are allowed to see everything in the allowed set except anything in the denied set. And what's more, if you've got dimension security set up on multiple attributes in the same dimension, the allowed set and denied set properties also have an impact on what you can see on other attributes of the same dimension. So, for example, if we go back to Visual Studio, here I can see bikes. Let's save this and let's deploy. And here in Excel, I've got a pivot table connected up to the cube, and I'm connecting through that role, and I can see, or I should be connected through that role. Let's deploy. Come on. Let me just check my connection. That is role. That is indeed role. I'm not an administrator. This is another thing, actually. It's a great time to point this out. What you will find is that in some cases, and this is very, very irritating, even when you make changes to a role, it doesn't always propagate up to the server. So if we perhaps delete my role, and so there's my role, let's delete it, and then redeploy. With a bit of luck. Frustrating. Let's not do that, but let's go through up here. Anyway, we'll be able to test the role in here. If I was to look at sales amount and look at my product hierarchy, I'm connecting as me and as administrator. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I will be able to connect as if I was a member of my role called role. And then I will be able to see on product category. Okay, all right, what am I doing? This was working absolutely perfectly earlier. Let's apply it here, shall we? All right, there we go. Oh, do you want to unmute yourself? Is that you? All right. So now let's connect as if I was a member of role and product category, and I only see bikes. I'm not sure what was going on there, but that works. Now, if we then apply security to subcategory and say, let's deny access, for example, to road bikes. So road bikes is there, and deploy, and then refresh here. What we will see is that when we put subcategories down on here, we can see everything underneath bikes except road bikes. So we can set up multiple levels of security on our role, on multiple attributes, and effectively everything gets combined together to create a single security permission across all of the attributes of the dimension. Now, one fairly common request that people have is to be able to deny access to an entire level of a hierarchy. So if I was to go back to my browser here, if I drag all of product category, or my category product user hierarchy onto here, I can see all of the members from all of the levels, except road bikes that I can't see. Now let's say that I don't want to be able to see product. The trick here is that if I go to product and I deselect absolutely everything, so I've got an allowed member set of an empty set, and I think I can see what might have gone on there. And when we deploy that, what we will see when we refresh is that if, for example, I try to drag category product onto here, I don't see anything at all. But if I take product away, then I'll see category and subcategory. So I'm going to be able to drill from category down to subcategory, but I'm not going to be able to drill any further down to product. So I've effectively denied access to all of the members on the product attribute, and that means that I've denied access to the product level as well as my user hierarchy. It's also worth pointing out that if a user is a member of multiple roles, the user will always be able to see all of the things they have access to combined across all of the roles they're a member of. So if you are a member of multiple roles, you will have all of the permissions of each role. There's no way that one role can deny access to a member to a particular item on a member on a hierarchy that is allowed in another role. Now, I've already shown you how you can test security in Visual Studio, BIDS, SSDTBI, call it what you will, by pressing the Change User button. Just to recap, if we click to change user, I can just say, let's connect either as the current person, i.e. me, I'm an administrator, I can develop, or connect as another user and enter a Windows username here, or connect as if I was a member of a role. However, I really dislike the Visual Studio Cube browser, and I much prefer to work in Excel. If I click the Analyze in Excel button up here in the browser window and connect to my cube, then here I'm going to click and browse the cube as me. And again, I'm an administrator. I can see all of the products, categories, and subcategories. But what happens if I actually want to test my role? Well, if you want to actually be able to test the role in Excel, what we need to do is to be able to set some connection string properties. Those two options that we saw in Visual Studio earlier, to connect as if I was a particular user or as if I was a member of a particular role, we can actually set as connection string properties in the connection string that Excel uses. So if I go up here to my connection in Excel and go to the definition tab, and I hack that definition and I say roles equal role. So what I've done is I've added that bit of text there to the connection string and click OK and say yes, I don't care about that. I'm now connecting as if I was a member of that role I've just been working on. I can see bikes, I can see mountain bikes and touring bikes but not road bikes, and I can't drill down any further than that. And equally, I could set the effective username property in here and set a Windows username like my domain, my username, assuming that that was a valid Windows username here. I can also use these properties inside Visual Studio, and I'm going to be doing that a lot later on. So if I create a new MDX query window, I can set connection string properties by clicking Options, going to Additional Connection Parameters, and say, again, roles equals role. That's my role name. Now, the role, or that connection string property, is applied to the query here. It's not applied to the metadata pane, strangely enough, but again, any query that I write in this is going to be run as if I was a member of that role that I've just created called role. When you're testing security, it can also be really useful to be able to see in Profiler what's going on when you connect and to see which roles people are a member of when they're connecting. Because a really common problem, and probably the one I've just been having, is that when you connect and you're testing security, you think you should be a member of a role, but actually you see way more than you think you ought to be able to. So it can be really useful to look and see what analysis services thinks you're connecting as when you connect. And we can do that in Profiler by looking at a number of interesting events. So here I've got a Profiler trace template that picks out some useful events. Basically, the interesting things to look at are the events in the security audit box and the session events box. I've also selected some events from queries events up here so we can see what's going on. But when I run this trace, what we'll see before we do anything else is a list of all of the connections that are currently open to analysis services. We can see, of course, who's connecting. But on existing session, what we're able to do is we can see, okay, not only each session, but we can see a list of all of the roles that this session is connecting using as. Now here I've got an asterisk, and that basically says I'm an administrator, I can see everything. And I see all of the other roles afterwards. But I can see here that there is a connection, and that is just the connection using the role connection string property. But even then, it's not really very easy always to see which application is connecting, even when you can see the username. So what I also do when I'm working in Excel testing roles is, in this case, we've got a connection already set up using my roles connection string property. But there's another property that can be really useful, and that is the application name connection string property. And what we can do here is just put in a bit of text. Let's call it Excel demo, click OK. And then in Profiler, we can very easily see all of the connections and all of the activity relating to just my session. So I can see very easily there's the session initialize event. I can see that I'm connecting as a member of role, and I can even see the two queries that are being run by Excel automatically when I connect. So that's another really useful thing that I do when I'm testing security using Profiler. Also, thinking about useful tools to help you do your job, don't forget BIDS Helper. I'm sure you have already heard about BIDS Helper. It's a really handy tool developed by the community and containing loads of really useful functionality for analysis services, integration services, and even reporting services developers. You can get hold of BIDS Helper by going to the BIDS Helper homepage and downloading it. It's regularly updated. There are versions for all versions of analysis services and all versions of Visual Studio, and it's got some really great functionality in there. Now, specifically, BIDS Helper has got two useful bits of functionality for people working with security. First of all, I can see here that I've got a whole bunch of roles, and it can be quite difficult in a moderately complicated project to work out what's in each role. So what BIDS Helper gives you is when you right-click on the roles dialog up here, you can choose Roles Report, and this will generate a reporting services report summarizing all of the information about all of the roles in your database. So you can see here, if I flick through, that we've got one page for each role, and then I can see the data sources. That's got access to the cubes. I've got highlighted some of the cell security that's coming up. I've got dimension security across all of my roles, and I can even see information about security on mining structures. And of course, I can click to print this, or I can copy and paste it into another documentation, another format like Word if I want to do some security documentation. So that's really handy. The other thing that BIDS Helper gives you is the ability to duplicate a role. Now you'd think, can't I just copy and paste a role in Visual Studio anyway? Well, you can, but it doesn't really work properly. The BIDS Helper duplicate role is the only way that you can actually genuinely usefully copy a role and create a new duplicated role inside your project. So if you haven't got BIDS Helper, go away and download it. If you have, check out this extra functionality. One last thing to say about ordinary boring dimension security is that, as always, there are complications with parent-child hierarchies. Personally, I am not a big fan of parent-child hierarchies. They have all kinds of problems with them. For example, security, they make calculations difficult, but the problems that you get with applying dimension security can also be a bit tricky. So two major restrictions with dimension security on parent-child hierarchies. First of all, you can't apply security to the key attribute of a dimension that contains a parent-child hierarchy. And secondly, allowing access to one member on a parent-child hierarchy will always give you access to all of its ancestors, and by default it will give you access to all of the members underneath it in the hierarchy unless you explicitly deny access to them. So let's have a look at this. If we go back to my role here, and let's go to the employee dimension just to make sure this is going to work properly. Let's deselect all members and then allow access to Amy Alberts. So I've only clicked Amy Alberts, but you can see already that I can see I've got Ken Sanchez, Brian Welker, and all of the people underneath Amy Alberts selected. So if I save that and deploy, and we go back to Excel and refresh and leave this, but put sales quantity quota on there and look at employee hierarchy, you can see that I've got access not only to Amy Alberts, but everybody underneath Amy Alberts. And I have to remember to untick Amy Alberts if I want to do that. So I would need to untick all of those options, save, and deploy if I want to deny access to the children of Amy Alberts. So if I refresh that, I can see Amy Alberts, but nothing underneath her, which is a bit irritating, to be honest, and another good reason to avoid parent-child hierarchies if you can. Now, let's get on to slightly more complicated topics. Another related problem to security is that if you're applying dimension security to any dimension, if you then have an MDX calculation which refers to a member that is no longer available through a role, then you're going to get errors when the end user connects. And this can be a real headache when you've got complicated cubes and you've got a lot of MDX calculations. And it's not immediately obvious how you get to work around this. So let me show you an example. If we go to my calculations tab, let's comment that out. What I've got here, let's comment that out, is a calculation, or a scoped assignment rather, on my order quantity measure. Now, let's keep that there for a moment, but let's have a look at order quantity. So there's order quantity. I can see the value. If I deploy and refresh, you can see that the calculation is being applied and order quantity has been increased. But what happens if inside my role I go to dimension data and measures and I deny access to order quantity? Now, I'm saying here that the user that connects through this role shouldn't see the value of order quantity. Now, you would hope that it would just mean that you can't see order quantity at all, but if I deploy this and then refresh, oh, we get a terrible error that when we connect saying the order quantity member was not found when the string order quantity was passed. And the pivot table gives us a horrible error message and we can't connect properly. So what can we do about this? Well, the workaround is a little bit involved. Let's comment that out. What we have to do instead is the following. First of all, you have to create a set. So here is the name set. I've called it security set. And the security set here uses a little bit of MDX to see whether order quantity is visible or not. So I can use the isError function here to say, well, okay, when I parse this bit of MDX, am I allowed to see order quantity? Now, if that returns an error, I'm returning an empty set. Otherwise, I'm returning a set that contains order quantity. So this set will be evaluated after the user connects, after the role has been evaluated. It will check to see whether order quantity is visible. If it is, that's great. If it isn't, then I'm going to return an empty set. And then I can use this set inside my scope statement. Instead of scoping on the measure itself, I scope on the set. And if the measure isn't visible, I'm scoping on an empty set, which doesn't do anything at all. So if I deploy and I refresh, then I don't see order amount there at all, but I'm still able to connect. I don't get any horrible error messages. So this is a little bit irritating, but it's something you have to bear in mind if you've got a cube with complex calculations and roles that could possibly hide some members that those calculations depend on. Moving on, cell security. So I'm going to assume you know how to use cell security. Cell security, of course, allows you to allow or deny access to individual individual cells inside your cube. But not everybody understands the difference between the different flavors of cell security. If we go to Visual Studio here again, I've got a new role, and I've got a role here that uses cell security, not dimension security. And first of all, I've got my cell security role set up to use read permissions. And in my read permissions box here, I can say, don't allow access to the order quantity measure. Now, if I go to Visual Studio and I make sure that this query window is connected through that Visual Studio role, that role that uses this cell security, I will be able to run this query, and of course we need to comment that out first, because I shouldn't have commented that out. And I can see there's order quantity NA'd out. But I've only denied access to order quantity, and read permissions in their dumbest form just say, am I allowed access to a cell or not? If I go back and uncomment this calculation here, which is measures.test, and it returns the value of order quantity, and I deploy this, then because I was using read permissions and not read contingent permissions, I'm able to see the value of order quantity coming through there, which is possibly not a good thing. So what I might want to do is go back to my role here, take this and use read contingent permissions instead. Now this is another scenario where I know sometimes when I deploy, the role doesn't always get picked up, but fingers crossed it will work today. And now when I run this query, you can see that access to test is denied as well, because Analysis Services has worked out that test looks at order quantity and I shouldn't be allowed to see the value of order quantity. So that's the difference between read contingent and read permissions. However, in some cases, read permissions do behave like read contingent permissions. So you might think that if I knew that I had read permissions that look like this, the easy way to get around them would be to just simply use a calculated member defined in the with clause of my query to be able to peek to see what's going on. For example, like this. So here I've defined a calculation in the with clause of my cube saying give me the value of order quantity, but when I run this, you can see that this is denied even though I've been using read permissions and even though I might expect this to be visible. And this is simply a kind of a fix introduced by the Analysis Services team to try and avoid the situations where people were just blindly using read permissions, didn't really know what was going on, and then found that actually it was quite easy to get around read permissions just by defining local calculated members. But in this situation, you can see that it's still not even kind of consistent with what's going on with calculated members on the server. So it's a bit of a gray area. There are a couple of other scenarios where read permissions will behave like read contingent permissions. For example, if you were applying security, for example, on your product subcategory hierarchy, you might think you'd be able to get around your security by using a subselect. That's certainly no longer possible after, I think, Analysis Services 2008 Service Pack 1. And I would hope that everybody out there is using at least Analysis Services 2008. The other very important thing to say about cell security is that it can really, really kill performance. Again, like parent-child hierarchies, there are some cases where you've absolutely got to use cell security, but in general, I think it's a good rule of thumb to avoid using cell security unless you absolutely have no other choice. Part of the reason why cell security can be very bad for performance is that it can prevent the use of bulk mode for calculations. It doesn't seem to do it in all cases nowadays, but I've seen plenty of scenarios where you've got a cube with lots and lots of calculations on it. As soon as you connect using a cell security role, performance goes absolutely awful. So in general, avoid using cell security. But you say, Chris, I can't avoid using cell security. Well, in some cases you can. Now, there are some cases where you absolutely can't avoid using cell security, but there are some cases where with a little bit of remodeling of your cube, you can replace cell security with dimension security. And let's see how. What I've got here is another role that uses cell security. And I've got read permissions here that say only allow access to the cells in this cube where the product current member is 346, and that's a mountain bike, and the order date is the 9th of July 2001. Now, when I go here and I connect as a member of that role that I've just showed you, so let's click connect and run, there's cell security working. So I can only see the values for this bike for this particular date, and everything else is security. I see an NA. But of course, this could be bad. How can I replace this? Well, when I've got cell security that relies on combinations of members from multiple dimensions that aren't the measures dimension, then I can, by remodeling the cube, replace cell security by some dimension security. How do you do this? Well, here's a nice simple example. Things can get a lot more complicated in the real world, though. I go to my data source view, or probably my fact table, and I create an extra member on here. So I've done this using a named calculation. In the real world, you not use named calculations because they're bad. You'd want to put this as another column on your fact table. And what I've done just for demo purposes is write a bit of SQL for my named calculation that says when order date key is 9th of July 2001 and product key is 346, then return 1, else 0. So now I'm going to be able to see which rows on my fact table I should be able to see and which ones I shouldn't. What I've then done is built a new dimension, which I've called security. And that dimension has the values 0 and 1 on it. And of course, I can then add that dimension to my cube, joining to that new column on the fact table, like so, using a regular relationship. And now having done that, of course, I can connect to I can create a role, I can go to dimension data, and I can apply security to that role and say only allow access to the member 1 on here. And of course, if I'm only allowing access to the member 1, then I'm only going to be able to see or have access to the rows in the fact table where that calculated field, that calculated column returned 1, which will of course be the roles for the bike and the date that I'm interested in. And that means that if I now connect using my replace dim role and reconnect, so this is my dimension security role, I can query and I can see the values that I'm allowed to see. I don't see NAs anymore. That's something we can't get around. I just see nulls instead. So the values that I'm not allowed to see will just simply be nulled out. It's not an ideal solution, like I said. It doesn't work if you've got any cell security that relies on controlling which measures you can see either. But in a lot of cases, it can be a handy little tip. And of course, as soon as you're using dimension security, performance is going to be improved a lot. Last of all, dynamic security. I'm going to assume pretty much that everybody's heard of dynamic security. Dynamic security is, in a nutshell, when a single role returns different permissions for different users. So if you've got 1,000 salespeople and you want each salesperson to only see their particular slice of data in the cube, rather than creating 1,000 roles, you can create one role which then returns for each salesperson only the slice of the cube they're allowed to see. Now, there are two ways of implementing dynamic security using two different MDX functions. There's the username function, which returns the Windows username of the current user that's connecting. And there is the custom data function, which is used to return the string passed through the custom data connection string property. And just to give you a quick demo of this, I've got a query set up here. If I set the custom data connection string property to be hello, like this, I can connect, I can run my query, and then you can see that the username function has returned my Windows username and custom data has returned hello, the bit of text that I passed through. And when we use these functions inside a dynamic security role, we're going to be able to take that information and then call to some external source or some source somewhere where I've stored all of my permissions and said, okay, well, this is Chris connecting. What has Chris got permissions to see? Now, username is the most commonly used approach. The username function is generally used when people are connecting directly to the cube, for example, from Excel, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to say, okay, who is it that's connecting? Custom data is used in scenarios when you have, for example, a web-based application. The web-based application has its own authentication, but you want to push data security back to analysis services. If we have a quick look at how we could use custom data, I've got a role here that uses some dimension security. I've got dimension security set up on product. And here in my allowed member set, I've got an expression that uses the value that custom data passes through to say, well, okay, only give me access to the product category that relates to the custom data, to the value passed in through that string. I've also put in a check here to see if custom data returns null. It can be really irritating when you're testing any dynamic security and you forget to put in the custom data connection string. In this situation, I've used the MDX error function to create a customized error. So if I just show you how that would work if I didn't remember to set a connection string property. So let's disconnect and reconnect. Oh, actually, I should have said let's connect using custom data demo. When I run this, you can see, I've got an error because security is not working, but at least I can see my own error message there. That is the one and only use for the MDX, practical use I found for the MDX error function for those MDX geeks out there. But of course, if I remember to set a product category key when I connect, and 1 is the key for bikes. When I run this query, I can see bikes. If I change this to be 2, I'm going to see components and so on. Now, like I said, this isn't what you would do in the real world because, of course, in the real world, if people are connecting directly through a client tool like Excel, because, of course, somebody would be able to hack the connection string property. But in that situation, you would end up using the username function. And here I've got an example of how you might use the username function. What I've done is on my dimension, sorry, actually, if we go back to the source data here, if we go to product category, I've created another named calculation, and on that named calculation, I'm creating a new field called user, where I'm saying if product category key is 1 for bikes, then return my username, otherwise return somebody else's username. And I've added that to my dimension as a new attribute called user. And then I've got dimension security set up on that attribute to say only give access to the member on the user on the hierarchy called user that matches the name brought through by username. And then if I now set up this connection to work through here, what's going to happen is when I run my query, I'm going to have access to just bikes. Now, this raises a question. This is a really simple demo showing you how the two main approaches to implementing the MDX for dynamic security. There's another question here, which is how do I actually store permissions? And there are two main ways you can go. You can either create a .NET DLL and upload that DLL to analysis services, and in there have a custom MDX function which, for example, connects out to a relational database, grabs permissions, and then brings that back to your role. Or you can model your security permissions as dimensions and measure groups inside your cube, and then just use a bit of MDX to query those measures and measure groups inside your role definition. In general, you should always go, I think, for the measure group approach for a couple of reasons. First of all, when a user first logs in, the permissions are evaluated several times, not just once, several times. So even though you've only got you might only have one attribute with dimension security on, that permission will be evaluated several times. And inside your DLL, if you're calling a custom function and then going out to a database, getting some permissions and bringing those permissions back, calling out to any external service is going to be expensive, and calling out to multiple times is going to be very, very expensive indeed. So it can be very slow to use the custom DLL approach. Secondly, and more importantly, is because connecting and evaluating permissions can be very slow, the first time that a user connects, analysis services will evaluate the permissions and then it will cache those permissions in its own special security cache. Now that means that if your permissions have changed, even though your DLL might go away, get the new change permissions, those will not be picked up until the next time the cube is processed, because analysis services will have cached the security permissions the first time the user connected. So that means that an end user could connect to the cube and then have their permissions revoked, and then they would still be able to connect even though you think you've revoked their permissions. Clearing the cache in the middle of the day is probably quite a bad thing and not something you should be doing. Now, the same applies for the measure group approach, but if you are if you've got your permissions stored in a measure group and the permissions changed, then in order to be able to update the measure group, you've just got to reprocess the measure group that contains those permissions. Now, reprocessing that measure group is not going to be, it's going to clear some caches, but it's not going to be as disastrous for performance as running a clear cache on the entire database, because reprocessing an individual measure group will clear the caches for that measure group and for the formula engine, but it won't clear the caches for the storage engine for other measure groups. So even though in both cases you're going to have to reprocess your measure group, or reprocess something, in the measure group approach, you only have to reprocess a measure group that actually is going to be very, very small indeed, and then you get less of the performance impact as a result. Now, that brings us nicely to the end of what I had to say. If you do, there was one other slide, but I won't talk about that. We've run out of time. Thank you for listening, everybody, and if you've got any questions, I would be happy to take them now.